The idea that addressing structural inequality and racism is racist against white people. On Tuesday, a conservative law firm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, filed a lawsuit to overturn President Biden's plan to cancel up to $20,000 in student loan debt for millions of borrowers. The suit argues that because the White House said the plan intends to help black students, borrowers, and other borrowers of color, it has a, quote, improper racial motive. They add, by creating and implementing a federal program with an improper racial motive, defendants violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection of the laws, which, among other things, prohibits federal spending based on race. In other words, the federal government can't assist students and borrowers of color because white lives matter. That lawsuit was dismissed a few days later, but that law firm has announced its plans to appeal. And then there's what happened at the Supreme Court this week when Alabama's Solicitor General argued that the state couldn't possibly prioritize race in the creation of its congressional redistricting maps because considering race could hurt white voters. In other words, strike that part of the Voting Rights Act because white lives matter. The central idea here is zero-sum politics, and I have just the person to talk to about this. Her name is Heather McGhee, and the book is called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. I mean, Heather, my friend, I literally thought of you as I saw this week unfold. Tell me, in your view, based on the brilliant book that you have written, how and why the 14th Amendment is being used to sort of strike down measures like the student loan cancellation that are intended to help historically disenfranchised groups of people?
Well, there's a huge amount of political and therefore economic profit to be made by convincing white voters that anything that is good for other Americans, even and including them, is somehow a threat, right? The idea, the zero-sum idea that we can't all progress together, that in fact progress for people of color must be a threat to white people. So take the student loans, for example. Who benefits from an historic up to $20,000 in student loan debt being canceled? Well, 20 million borrowers, the vast majority of whom are working and middle-class people, the majority of whom are white. Does it attack the racial wealth disparity? Yes. Why? Not because black people are just so lazy that we borrow a lot, but because of a racial wealth divide that was created by public policy. A racial wealth divide that means that today a black college graduate has less wealth on average than a white high school dropout. So the bottom line here is that these policies, the idea of having voting rights in the country where politicians don't pick their voters, but voters pick their politicians, the idea of having affordable college, it's good for everyone. Yeah. And yet conservatives want to break a working class, multiracial coalition to make white voters side with their color instead of their class. They want to profit economically from that rigged political system. And so they keep sort of hammering this point, this lie of the zero sum, that we can't all be beneficiaries of government in the public interest.
I mean, you see that again at the Supreme Court, right, where we're talking about the Voting Rights Act and the idea of having a prosperous American democracy where the right to vote, where we enfranchise everyone, has now become some kind of like subconscious call to just enfranchise black voters, right? And what, I mean, we saw this play out in the 2020 election. Mail-in voting also helps Republicans.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet the process of enfranchising people to vote has become a partisan issue for Republicans. How do we unwind that? I mean, what is the argument that is to be made? Because the data clearly isn't convincing the GOP and conservatives.
Yeah, it's really about raw power. But I think what we do is we make cross-racial movements. I just spent the last 6 months going across the country telling stories for a podcast, also called The Sum of Us, of people who actually break this loggerheads, right? They come together across lines of race. In Florida, an issue that was born in Jim Crow, the lifetime ban on people with felony convictions voting, got a multiracial, bipartisan, 60+% majority at the ballot saying we don't want that vestige of Jim Crow. We think people who served their time should be able to vote. This old piece of Jim Crow is holding back citizens all over Florida from being able to vote. And so it is possible. There is still in the country support for these ideas. Student loan cancellation, voting rights, the idea of, being able to have nice things for everyone, yes. Right? And yet that's why the right wing is so focused on this one element of the culture war to try to basically terrify white voters into thinking that anything good that the Biden administration does is somehow going to harm them.
The Biden administration did make a major move on marijuana, the pardon, basically, of all federal offenses for the simple possession of marijuana, which got some bipartisan, at least Republicans were not vilifying that in the way that they have student debt. So there is hope here somehow.
Yeah, there is hope here. I mean, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Koch brothers have been pushing for this kind of, decriminalization, and that's a good thing. Listen, there's a lot of places in this country where black and white voters see eye to eye, and that is fundamentally terrifying to the Republican Party.
It is not terrifying to me, and you can hear more about it on your fantastic podcast. Heather McGhee, the author of The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Thank you for making time to join us and listen to that absurd Kanye West interview.